Australia nearly didn't happen. Not the continent, the country, the Commonwealth, the thing we take for granted every time we pull out a passport or watch a federal election. For most of the 1800s, Australia was not one nation. It was 6 separate bickering British colonies who couldn't agree on a train gauge, let alone a constitution. And the story of how they finally became one is messier, pettier, and far more interesting than anything you were taught in school. But here's what almost nobody knows. When the Australian Federation date of the 1st of January, 1901 was locked in, when the ink was already dry and the ceremony was being planned, one colony still hadn't voted yes. Western Australia was weeks away from the goldfields population pulling off a breakaway and joining the new nation without their own government's permission. There was even a name for the would-be breakaway state. They were going to call it Australia. Australia very nearly started as 5 states and 1 rogue territory fighting to join them. How that got resolved, and what it took to drag 6 colonies across the line, is the real story of Australian Federation. The push really starts with one man and one speech. On the 24th of October 1889, the Premier of New South Wales, a self-made immigrant named Henry Parkes, stopped overnight in the small border town of Tenterfield. He stood up at the local School of Arts and told the crowd that what the Americans had achieved through war, Australians could bring about in peace. He called for a great national government for all Australia. The newspapers picked it up the next morning, and for the first time Federation stopped being a politician's conversation and became a public one. Parkes spent the next 12 months delivering versions of that speech across the country. The man was 74 years old and had gone bankrupt twice. He didn't live to see Federation, but without him, the whole thing likely collapses before it begins. This is exactly the kind of Australian history that True Blue Education was built to tell straight. If this is your thing, hit subscribe and stick around. The colonies were then sent to thrash out a constitution, a process that took most of the 1890s and nearly fell apart more than once. The core problem was money. Victoria wanted protective tariffs on imported goods. New South Wales, the biggest colony, wanted free trade. These weren't philosophical differences. They were economic lifelines. Industries, jobs, and entire local economies depended on which side won. New South Wales was so unhappy with the first draft constitution in 1898 that the referendum failed to meet the required threshold. The whole project stalled. It took 2 more years of negotiation, colonies travelling to London to lobby the British government directly, deals struck over capital city locations, revenue guarantees inserted into the constitution, before 5 of the 6 colonies finally voted yes. Which brings us back to Western Australia. Premier John Forrest had spent years stalling. His core political support came from the farming regions, and those voters were deeply suspicious of Federation. But the goldfields were a different story entirely. The miners, most of them migrants from the eastern colonies, were furious. They had been petitioning Perth for years and getting nowhere. By 1900 they were ready to act. A formal separatist movement took shape. They drew up plans for a breakaway state. They chose the name Australia, and they made clear they would hold their own referendum and join the Commonwealth without Forrest's blessing if he didn't move. Forrest moved. He extracted every concession he could, phased tariff arrangements, infrastructure guarantees, special revenue protections, and put Federation to a vote. Western Australia said yes on the 31st of July 1900, 3 weeks after the British Parliament had already passed the Australian Constitution into law. Australia never happened, but it came close enough that its name was already chosen. True Blue Education covers the history that deserves more than a textbook paragraph. Subscribe if you want more of it. On the 1st of January 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia came into existence in Centennial Park, Sydney. 6 colonies became one nation. Edmund Barton was sworn in as Prime Minister. The crowd was enormous. The moment was real. It had taken a decade of conventions, 2 failed referendums, 6 colonies worth of competing interests, and 1 near breakaway state with a name already picked out. Australia happened. Australia didn't, but only just.